You are a hero while the world sleeps. The one we never know.
Hey church, today I want us to think about having confidence in God's power to change lives. That's what we see in Acts chapter 9 verses 32 to 43. I won't read it now, and I encourage you to pause this video and watch it if you haven't, read it if you haven't already. But in this passage, that's what we see. We see Peter having confidence in God's power to change lives, and that we should find our confidence in God's power as well. What's really interesting to me in this little passage is how God and Peter are working together. You know, Peter's this flaky character in most of the New Testament, isn't he? He's the guy who probably could have coined the phrase to step out of the boat. He was the guy who didn't like getting out of his comfort zone and very often retreated to his comfort zone. He's the guy that Jesus did call out of the boat, maybe even coined the phrase to take a step of faith, that is to trust in God. This is Peter, and it's often why we so often resonate with him, isn't it? Because he's always failing. He's not trusting God like he should, or how he knows how to. But here we see him trusting in God's power to save. I see two miracles explicitly and a third kind of implied in the text. The first two, of course, are God healing the paralytic man who'd been paralyzed for 8 years. And the second one is God raising to life this woman who'd been dead, at least for a couple of days. And in both situations, we see that Peter, in the first one, he finds this man on his journey. And the second lady, he is urged to go and see, the text says. And so in his circumstances in life, these people appear to him. But in both circumstances, we see him rely on God's power to change people's lives. In the first situation, he says, in the name of Jesus, get up, make your bed, he says. In the name of Jesus. In the second passage, it says he closed the door, he pushed everybody out, closed the door, and he got on his knees and he prayed, showing us that Peter is trusting in God's power to change lives. There's a third little miracle I see implied in this passage, which is in verse 32, the very first line. It says, as Peter traveled about the country. This is very interesting for Peter. You know, he's that guy who likes being in his comfort zone. He likes being in Jerusalem, in this Jewish Christian church. But here's Peter going outside into a semi-Gentile area, and then immediately into what happens next is that moment with Cornelius, the Gentile Roman centurion. And so here's Peter going beyond his comfort zone, taking a step of faith, trusting in God's power. Why does he do that? How can he do that? I think partly it's because he, in the moment before in Acts, he's just spent 15 days with Paul, who was Saul, and he's just seen God's power change Saul into Paul, into this, from this persecuting Christian man to this Christian man. And he's seen God's power change Paul so deeply. I think he's like, I can't stay still here. I'm watching Paul speak to the Gentiles. I got to be out there too, seeing God's power at work in people's lives. And I think he takes so much confidence from seeing Paul's life changed. And what's Paul's life changed by? It's changed by the gospel, isn't it? That's where God's power is. It's in the gospel. That'd be a good question. What's God's power? What should we expect? Where do we see God at work in the world? How does God show his power today? You've got to remember, miracles in Acts, they become less and less important, partly because I think they're always signs of something else, important signs of something else. And in this passage, we're kind of seeing, I think, a dramatized telling of the gospel. We see a crippled man made whole. We see a dead woman raised to life. This is the gospel, the good news. It's the message of life and of life after death. And what I love seeing is Peter in verse 41. He says he took her by the hand, he helped her to her feet, then he called the believers and the widows, and he presented her to them alive. That's the gospel, isn't it? The gospel makes us alive to God, alive with him forever. So my question for us today is, have you got confidence in God's power to change lives? Because I really think that to the extent that you've got confidence in God's power, not our own or anything we can do, but in God's power to change lives, is to the extent that our own lives will be changed by his power